Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Donna McCallie-Holly. I am the Grant and Program Coordinator for the Lake Hopatcong Foundation. Thank you for being with us this evening. I'd like to thank you all for coming. This evening, we are going to be doing a program called Climate Change Fiction, just for fun or forecasting the future. The presentation is part of the Lake Hopatcong Historic Flood of 2000 and Climate Change Program and Exhibit, and was made possible by a grant from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, a state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please welcome Ted Howell, a professor in Writing and Arts and Geography, Planning and Sustainability Department at Rowan University. He teaches a course on Cli-Fi to engage audiences in a larger conversation about the expanding genre, which deals with the impact of climate change and global warming. Through his courses, Ted encourages students to develop their capacity for ecological thought, enabling them to find an actionable solution to incredibly complex problems. So again, thank you all for joining us. Ted, I'll turn the program over to you if you'd like to share your screen.
Yes, thank you so much, Donna. I really appreciate it. Thank you to all of you for being here. It's just such a joy to see so many folks here to give me a chance to talk about what is very much my favorite thing to talk about, which is what reading works of fiction and imaginative writing and thinking more generally can help us when it comes to talking about, learning about, and planning for the future of climate change. So the things I'm going to share with you today relate to my own specialty, which I have a PhD in English literature from Temple University. And while I was there, I began to incorporate a lot more environmental issues into my work, both into my scholarly work, but even more so into my teaching when I'm interacting with students and giving them a chance to learn about environmental issues, because young folks today, as most of my college students are very, very concerned about climate change. They have very high levels of what we call ecological anxiety or eco-anxiety. They've lived their whole lives hearing about how climate change is going to be a big problem, especially in the future. So a lot of the teaching that I do revolves around trying to teach them and help them understand and learn about some new and interesting and different ways of talking about climate change. So that's what I'm going to share with you here today, starting with some slides that I have created. I'm just going to make them full into presentation mode here. So that's me. I'm at Rowan University. I am primarily in what's called the Writing Arts Department. So I teach a lot of writing students. But as of very recently, I am also in the Geography, Planning, and Sustainability Department, where I teach environmental studies as well. So that aligns very nicely with my interests and gives me a chance to meet all kinds of wonderful students. So I will definitely pause here, as I go through my slides. It's not a particularly long slideshow. It is designed to give everyone a brief introduction and perhaps some possible reading recommendations or paths into thinking about this genre of Cli-Fi, which is short for climate change fiction. So I'll introduce it to you. I'll give you some reading suggestions, some things that I think are really great representations of this genre or style of literature. And then I would just love to hear any questions or talk more about it with anyone. But just to get started, I want to ask, this is a rhetorical question, right? I have an answer on the next page, but just kind of think to yourself, when you think about scientific projections of future climate change, right? Like what the climate is going to look like in the future, all right? This is the way that we most commonly talk about climate change in terms of the way that it's being forecast. Right? We get stuff like this, all right? This is a graph of some climate models, which were designed by, just brilliant climate scientists who have worked together to crunch massive amounts of data and fed them into a computer, and then sketched out these potential pathways based on how much the temperature is likely to rise. Okay. Now, this is very complicated. All right. I am not expecting you to like look at this graph and understand what's going on. Right. And that is in fact my whole point. So even this work here, which is a graph, which is generally easy to understand than reading a scientific article, right? And even this being the result of so many scientists trying to crunch together and simplify and put all of the research that they've done into these very specific numbers. This is one of the ways that we're used to, I think, talking about and thinking about this future of climate change, right? Either the temperature is going to keep going way up if we stay on this path, or maybe we'll go on a different path and it'll go down. And, right? It's this idea that's really scientifically heavy. It's based on, 2.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It gets really complicated really fast, even if the basic point is the Earth is probably going to be hotter in 2100 than it is now. Even when we get, again, I'm trying to almost overwhelm you with information. I'm doing this on purpose, so don't be alarmed by all of the information on here. Even this, which is one of the best graphics that I have ever seen, it's by the World Wildlife Foundation, in terms of trying to capture all of these different aspects of global warming and what the future is going to look like based on these two different scenarios. Like, is it going to get this much hotter? Is it going to get that much hotter? Right. Again, really good graphic. It looks really nice. It's very, I think, comprehensive as far as infographics go. It goes into a bunch of different things. We know we're going to get more extreme weather. There's going to be less water. We know about sea level rise. We know about oceans and the biodiversity loss involved there. So again, pretty nice job here overall of packaging extremely complicated information, which comes from a wide range of fields of study, of scientific and social and cultural study, put together into this one small infographic that has to leave room for cute pandas and polar bears and bees, right? So again, pretty simple packaging based on all the science, but still really overwhelming, right? Both overwhelming in terms of the amount of information which is packed on here, kind of drives home for us what it's like to talk about climate change in the future and all of the different impacts that it's going to have. So this is like the data, the numbers, the science, simplified, presented in very, generally easy to consume ways. But what will the world actually look like? Okay, so this is where it starts to get a little bit different. So we can read these numbers, we can look at projections, we can talk about temperature and sea level rise in terms of the facts and the figures. But a lot of folks have really tried to imagine what is this future world going to look like. And from my perspective, and I'm so, as someone who has studied this and been thinking about this and looking at this for years and years, the dominant way of talking about it is through what I will call like, an apocalyptic vision of the future, right? So we have films that are now almost 20 years old, like this movie, The Day After Tomorrow, came out almost 20 years ago now, okay? It has this really catastrophic impacts of climate change, which are not very solidly based on science, right? A more recent film in the bottom left there is Mad Max Fury Road, in which humanity lives in this like desert hellscape, right? Where there's a very small amount of water that everyone's fighting over. It's a movie with really spectacular design and acting and action scenes, right? But it paints this vision of the future as this apocalyptic landscape that humans are really struggling to survive. On the top left, there's a still from the TV show called The World Without Us, which was based on a book of the same name, where a lot of times we imagine perhaps what would the world look like if humans were no longer here? Or what would an abandoned city look like if, if humans suddenly disappeared, and how would the earth take over? So even though these are very different visions of the future in terms of what the future might look like, they all run through this strand of apocalypticism, right? That things are going to be very bad. And this can be very alarming, right? Now, one thing I want to point out to folks today, and this your audience here in Lake Kapataton are not really, you don't need to show you this. I mean, I have a picture from your website on the right there of this historic flood from 20 years ago. Okay, on the left are some images of the flooding of New York City from Hurricane Sandy, which are, made the rounds in that period of time. So we're already facing these effects of climate change, right? So even though we have these facts and figures about what the future is going to look like, and even though we have these examples of these apocalyptic hellscapes, in reality, we can already look around us, I think, and see what the future of climate change is going to look like, which is just, unless, barring monumental human effort and innovation and expenditure and collective willpower, you can build a city, you can rebuild your city in such a way to minimize the impacts of these extreme climate change weather events induced by climate change. The thing that climate change does in terms of weather, which scientists are absolutely certain about, is it makes events like this more frequent and more severe, right? So we can already look around us and see. And when I teach students about climate change, one thing that I always show you, one of my favorite articles about this was from the Washington Post in 2019. This was the first in a series called 2 degrees Celsius above the limit. Extreme climate change has arrived in America. And this article starts with the lake, right? Over now, this would be, I think this picture was set as being taken in like the first decade of the 20th century, maybe 1904, 1906, something like that. And one of the things that I teach my students is, we can look at places in New Jersey. New Jersey is one of the states in the US which is getting hotter faster, right? The temperature is rising. And this wonderful Washington Post article talks about that, gives some examples, talks about the impact this has made on the tourism in your region. And I think it's really powerful, right? So you can look around you, you folks more than most, and see what the impacts of climate change are going to be, right? We have something to think about here. This is a famous photo, okay, from a couple years ago during the time of California wildfires. Here we have some golfers finishing their round while the hillside above them is engulfed in flames, right? Again, this is from the recent past, right? Not the distant future. And you can see, the reason I like this image is it kind of demonstrates one of the key facts about climate change, which is that it will impact different people differently, right? So these folks are obviously don't feel threatened by the wildfire. They feel perfectly competent and safe about their ability to get away from it. And they're literally like not concerned with it, right? One of the main stories of climate change in the future ahead of us is going to be human migration, right? It talks about, the way that different people are able to adapt to climate change differently. We're going to see a rise of climate refugees in the near future. And I chose this picture here just to demonstrate some of the ways that, for these folks in this picture, a extreme weather event is something that they feel perfectly comfortable. It's not threatening their livelihood here, right? But for millions of people around the world, they will have much less of an easy time getting away from the impacts of climate change. So I wanted to frame this conversation in this way as in order to talk about cli-fi, right? Or climate change fiction and the role that I think it has of helping us think about this future that's awaiting us in a different and interesting way. So a little bit about CliFi. I think the thing about it that's the most interesting is that it is very popular, in articles that are written in the press. Okay, so these are some of the earlier articles that were written. These are from 6 years ago now. Okay, I think I myself first heard about CliFi in 2014, in the spring of 2014. So in terms of a term that it hasn't really been around for that long, but the reason I think that it really took off was that there were a slew of articles written about it, and the impact that it had. Here's a couple more recent ones, okay, including one from The Guardian on the right that was just published this year, okay, kind of talking about, even we're at the point now with CliFi where this article in The Guardian can talk about the new CliFi as if there's kind of another wave of climate change fiction coming out. But if you don't really know anything about it or haven't heard anything about it, that, this old versus new doesn't make much difference to you. But it is a term that was invented by a journalist who lives in Taiwan by the name of Dan Bloom. And of course, he invented it as a play on sci-fi, right? Short for science fiction. He thought that it would be really nice to have a similarly catchy term. He's an environmental activist himself, Dan Bloom. So he invented this word around about 2000, he says, and it started, making a big impact later on. Margaret Atwood is mentioned in here, and I think I want to share, she's perhaps the most well-known author who is aligned with CliFi. Margaret Atwood is, even more prominent as a voice now after the success of the Handmaid's Tale show on Hulu, which brought a lot of attention back to her work and gave her a platform to talk about a lot of stuff. But I think that I want to help. One way I like to think about CliFi, and I find it's very helpful for folks as they're learning about it for the first time, is Margaret Atwood. She didn't invent this term, but she's defining it in an essay that she wrote, talking about the work that she writes as speculative fiction, right, as opposed to science fiction, right? And she's doing this as a way of distinguishing two different types of forecasting of the future types of writing. So she says science fiction is the books that descend from stuff like H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds, right, where you have Martians come down and shoot people, right? Things that could not possibly happen. Whereas for Margaret Atwood, speculative fiction is the term that she prefers. Plots that descend from Jules Verne's books about submarines and balloon travel and such, that being 2000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days, books that Jules Verne wrote around the same time that Wells was writing some of his famous stories. These are things that when Jules Verne was writing, they could have happened, sort of, right? They just hadn't completely happened when the authors wrote the book, right? So there was such a thing as a submarine when Jules Verne wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He, of course, elaborated and expanded on the idea. There was such a thing as a hot air balloon that you could travel with. The technology was very early, and it was just kind of pardon the pun, but just getting off the ground, right? But he saw in these things that were happening around him the potential for these cool stories if he speculated on these ideas that were based in reality. So that's Margaret Atwood's distinction, which I think is really helpful when talking about CliFi. That's the thing that offers a lot of authors this idea that, well, I'm not just inventing these things that couldn't possibly happen, right? I'm basing these visions of the future and these worlds that I'm building that are based in this future time. I'm basing them on things that are currently happening now. And here's what would happen if they got worse, or if they got better, or if they were different. Okay. It's not, Martians shooting people. It's current technologies, current trends extrapolated into the future. Now would be a good time to stop before I start talking about individual works of fiction to see if anyone has any questions about the setup that I'm doing here, like some of the stuff about the science as well as this sort of distinction with speculative fiction.
Doesn't look like we have anything in the chat yet.
Okay. No worries. I realized it'd be a good place to pause, because the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about some individual works of Cli-Fi. And I have chosen these specifically as ones that it feels a little silly with this genre that's brand new, but perhaps might be considered like classic sort of works of Cli-Fi. These are the ones that if you do a Google search for Cli-Fi, if you look for like books about Cli-Fi, a bunch of these will come up, right? And I've chosen them because they have like a kind of a wide range and help you see what this genre looks like and how authors are tackling it. So I'll start with Margaret Atwood herself. Her trilogy called the MaddAddam trilogy. All right, with the first book, Oryx and Crake, came out in 2003. So this is one of the oldest works of literature that gets this terminology, right, of Cli-Fi. More than Oryx and Crake, the first book, it's actually the second book, The Year of the Flood, which is less well known. It was kind of the second book in this trilogy. So that one deals with environmental themes more heavily. But the thing that's interesting about Atwood's trilogy, and one of the reasons that I think it's a good sort of early example of Cli-Fi, is that climate change is not the only thing that's happening in this future world that she's talking about, right? She calls it everything change in a sense, right? There's bioengineering, there's like people being obsessed with video games, and like, this is very early in the age of the internet, but she pictures like what this in World Wide Web could look like. Just like the kind of trends of capitalism and consumerism that she saw as troubling at the time are really magnified and amplified in the work, like kind of leading into the future. And it is a book that, like many of these works of Cli-Fi, is set on the cusp of one of these apocalyptic time periods, right? So again, I think it's a good example of this, one of these ways that people write about Cli-Fi where there's some sort of like apocalyptic event and climate change is part of it, right? And that's what gets worked into the story. So Atwood's books are really wonderful. I think personally Oryx and Crake is the best one. The Year of the Flood is also quite good. And the MaddAddam really I found a bit disappointing, but I'm glad I finished the trilogy. But the works are, her imagination is very good, and it's also very like fierce and it can be very uncomfortable, some of these works, like the way that she envisions the future. A very different type of work, which is also now over 10 years old, is a book called The Wind-Up Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi. All right, Bacigalupi is also well known for a book that he wrote called The Water Knife, which came out later. I believe that was 2015 or 2016, the Water Knife. But this is an interesting book because it is set 4 centuries into the future, or like, I guess about 3.5 technically. And it's set in 23rd century Thailand, which is actually below sea level. So there's these really cool, inventive visions of a future city that is kept dry by these massive pumps that like pump the water back out into the ocean. It's a post-fossil fuel energy system, so there's almost no fossil fuels remaining. And instead, everything is run by either animal or human power. So the kind of fuel is actually just calories. So it does this really interesting things. Like this is one of the examples of a work of Cli-Fi where somebody, Bacigalupi, like looks into this distant future and just comes up with this extremely inventive, very, very interesting future world, right? Which is not really necessarily apocalyptic, right? It's just kind of thinking, well, if there's no fossil fuels, if sea level rises, if these current trends continue, what might the world look like? It does this really cool thing, which is actually really common in these works of fiction that envision the future. It's really common in a lot of works of science fiction and fantasy as well. And I'm sure some of you can think of examples like even like a Game of Thrones is very famous for this, like kind of having different perspectives, right? So like you move from one character to the next, and now you're in a different character's perspective, right? And what that does, the reason that so many authors like this method is it allows you to really see the world that they've created through different perspectives. I see a really good question in the chat from William, and yes, there are sci-fi authors who talk about utopias, and I'm going to get to that in just 1 second. That's a great question. That's actually one of my favorite things to talk about. But before I do that, I'm going to share with you a very different work that is often associated with sci-fi in ways that I think are really interesting. This is Kingsolver's Flight Behavior. Again, Barbara Kingsolver, author of the Poisonwood Bible, her book Unsheltered, set in Vineland, New Jersey from 3-4 years ago, is also quite good and has some ecological themes in it. But Flight Behavior is really cool because it is set in the present. Like it imagines one single event changing in the present time, the present that Kingsolver is writing in 10 years ago, in which instead of migrating to their typical roosting grounds in Mexico, monarch butterflies descend on this southern Appalachian town and cause a bunch of havoc, right? And it's a really great work of fiction in terms of tackling climate change because it's extremely realistic. I've said it here in my slides as a direct contrast to these other two that came before, which have these really wild sort of, either dystopian or, wildly, radically different visions of the future. And then we have Kingsolver, which is a book set in the present, in a current place, right? And it deals with a lot of issues which are extremely relevant, like class and religion, and the way that people in small towns gossip with one another in really interesting ways. It has some great stuff about convincing scientists to intervene and share their influence. But it's a really, really wonderful book. That is, I think, a great example of the way that you can incorporate these themes of climate change into a work of fiction, while at the same time making it like a realistic work of literary fiction, like so many of the ones that we read. Here's our utopian author, okay, which is Kim Stanley Robinson, who is a sci-fi author who has been really spending the last 10 years of his career tackling these visions of the future that are not dystopian, right? And Robinson is one of the few authors who I've ever heard admit to being a utopian himself, right? He's not, a lot of times when we think about utopian, we envision like a person who's like a pie in the sky, like dreamy, unrealistic. This is not our writer here, Kim Stanley Robinson. His utopianism is very realistic and is very intentional, right? He's kind of saying like, I am purposefully trying to tell a story of the future that has these massive impacts of climate change that shows the way humans could adapt in ways that are not just, humans scrounging for food in the desert and attacking one another with giant spiky trucks like in Mad Max, right? So Robinson's works are often very long. This one I'm recommending is New York 2140. As you can see, the timeline is roughly 100 years into the future. It adopts very purposefully and intentionally what is a very extreme projection about how much of Lower Manhattan would be underwater if there was, I believe Robinson said it was like somewhere between 15 and 20 feet of sea level rise, which is like really extreme, on the really extreme end of what most scientists will predict. And then, so anyway, it's got the same thing as Machkalupi, where it's got these multiple narrators, right? And it really is focused on what I call human adaptation, problem solving. So folks are like, our city is underwater. What does it look like to live in this place? There's some really interesting stories. Again, if you're like an engineer, this kind of stuff is really interesting. There's like chapters about how they have created like a waterproof seal around this tower that folks live in, and how all of the buildings have created this, like, these basements that pump water and have this like high-tech sealant. This kind of stuff is really interesting to me. His book, The Ministry for the Future, which came out 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, was really well received. It got a lot of people talking about it. President Obama put it on his list of books that, to recommend for the year of 2021. So it's another book that you'll often see, is this book, The Ministry for the Future. That's another one that's really long and is perhaps a little bit less optimistic than New York 2140, but has some really great stuff. So I see a question from Holly about a person who's new and what one book would I recommend. I actually do have an answer to that at the end. And then, Caitlin's asking about science fiction films being praised for and measured by their scientific accuracy. Yes, a lot of these books have been praised for their scientific accuracy. I think specifically Kim Stanley Robinson's work, this is something that he takes extremely seriously. He pays very close attention to what the scientists are projecting and forecasting about the future with climate change. So his works are often, yes, very much praised for their scientific accuracy. In fact, specifically, some scientists that I read praised one of his earlier works that was written in the 2007, 2008, as being particularly scientifically accurate. So yes, they have. It's a great question. Okay, one last one, which is a great recent book. And I think that this is my answer to the question. If I was going to just recommend one work of Cli-Fi to a person, I would want to hear, and this is a question I love to take, is if you tell me what kind of books you like to read, I can try and think of a work of Cli-Fi that I think you will like. But here is a really good one. It's called The End of the Ocean by Maya Lundi. Lundi's book, The History of Bees, came out in 2008, which is also an amazing book. It's a little bit less about climate change, climate focus specifically. But that book is marvelous. It's probably maybe a little better in terms of a work of fiction than The End of the Ocean, but The End of the Ocean, like the themes are just magical. I think it's beautiful. It's extremely well written. It does this really cool thing where it has dual narratives. Half of the book is set in 2019, which is about the present that Lundi was writing in. Half of the book is set 20 years later in 2041. So it does some really interesting things of making some, I think, really compelling and interesting insights into the state of the way we think about climate change and environmental issues now, both in terms of our politics and our imaginations. But it also does this really interesting work of forecasting the future. And this one, again, is extremely accurate in its way that it hews to reasonable and scientifically accepted visions of what the future would look like as a result of climate change. And the thing that I think is really great about this book, and the reason I recommend it the most, is that it has a very simple and elegant style. Like it's actually translated from Norwegian. Lundi is a Norwegian author. The translator did a marvelous work translating it, because the thing that the book does is it allows you to read along in a very immersive, calming, almost way. Like the sentences are just very eloquent. They're relatively short, right? It just kind of takes you step by step through the story. But at the same time that it is caressing you almost with this beautiful style and like these really nice sentences, it's depicting really extreme events in many cases, right? Both things that happen to the characters, things that happen with extreme weather. And I think that it does a really great job of striking this balance between a book that you really just love to read because you want to know what's going to happen to the characters, and you're just enjoying the story on a simple level of the writing being so fine. But then you are confronted with the force of these really extreme events, and it helps you imagine what the future would look like. And this, I know I have some other recommended reading as well, which I'll just share. I won't give you like a full detailed about it. I think Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, again, is probably the oldest work that I would recommend as a work of real cli-fi. Butler herself came of age and did a bunch of research in the mid to late 80s, which was the time that climate science was really starting to emerge as something that folks other than scientists were talking about. And Butler in the late 80s was really tied into that, and has all these wonderful news clippings in her archives where you can see her starting to realize, oh, this climate change thing, like she's doing this in 1986, 1987. Oh, this climate change thing is a really big deal. Like this is really something that's going to impact our future. And then that goes into her marvelous novel, Parable of the Sower. Gun Island is by Amitav Ghosh, right? He's an Indian American author. This came out last year. It's set in the Maldives, right? And it is, again, just a really cool story. Like it has sort of like a crime, plot that drives it forward, and it has some of these interesting events that happen, and it's also quite a good book if you're a person who's more interested in works that take you to interesting and exotic places. Ghosh's book is really good. Gun Island, I strongly recommend that one. And then finally, I have on the right here the book Gold Fame Citrus by Claire Vaye Watkins. Okay. And this is a really special book, which is, if you're into something, if you're a person who likes to read books that are just kind of weird and strange, and like you read them and you think, man, this author is really interesting. Like in Watkins' case, like this vision of future, it's just, like she does some really interesting and sort of experimental things on the page. Like there's a book that has like, it kind of turns into a journal halfway through where there's these sketches in it, and it's really, really interesting and inventive, right? It's not a book I recommend to everyone because it's just deeply strange in a lot of really interesting ways. But at the same time, it's really quite good, really quite good. So while I'm here on this screen, I will answer Holly's questions about older works that predicted a future that's already come to be, because the best answer to that one is actually Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. This book was published in 1993, and the main focus of it, the primary implication of climate change that we see in the story are massive, out of control wildfires in Northern California induced by drought and extreme heat. So this is one of these things where, again, like there have always been wildfires in California, right? But there were not many folks in 1990 who were predicting the situation that we now see in California, where wildfire season is longer, more dangerous, less able, it's much harder to adapt to it. Butler also kind of had a moment in the sun after the election of President Trump, because in the sequel to this book, this isn't about climate change, but it's just one of these fun facts about science fiction writers and the things that they can come up with. In the second book, which is called Parable of the Talents, the sequel to Parable of the Sower, Octavia Butler depicts a presidential candidate who is this deeply religious character who runs on the slogan, "Make America Great Again." Like literally, that's exactly the slogan that this presidential candidate runs on. And it's really, it's just kind of reading it today is really shocking, because of course she had no way of predicting literally, that there would be a President Trump and that this would be his campaign slogan, and that it would be so appealing to so many people. But that, it's just kind of one of those startling things. So that's, again, not about climate change fiction, but one of these cool things about sci-fi and the way that it works. I mean, you can go through the works of the novels of H.G. Wells, specifically from 100 years, 200 years ago, and find like every single invention, that he predicted, because he just wrote millions of pages, was constantly thinking of all kinds of wonderful and outlandish things. But that's a really fun thing to do. Okay. One other thing that I'll share, especially for this is helpful for folks who spend time in libraries or have young people in their lives, that there's a lot of cli-fi in this general genre of young adult fiction. This is a topic which is very popular. Paolo Bacigalupi, who I shared with earlier as the author of The Wind-Up Girl and The Water Knife, has written a series of books that were finalists for the National Book Award. These are, for young adult readers. They also have this predictions about the future. And there's a bunch more, right? I have a few on the screen here just as examples. These are ones that I am familiar with myself. I haven't actually read all of these, but they're ones that I've heard other folks talk about. And I really think it's important to know this too. It's not just for you as an adult, right? Again, I'm not sure exactly who's here. You may be a young adult yourself, or love to just love to read young adult fiction, but there is quite a bit of it that tackles this topic. Okay, now's another good time to see if anybody has any questions before I get a little bit. I have one more cool thing to share.
Oh, I don't see any popping in.
Okay, thank you. All right. So I just thought that one thing that folks often ask, which I love, is a question is really interesting, is whether these works of environmental literature or climate change fiction, like, do they actually change people's minds? And there's a scholar, Matthew Schneider Meyerson, colleague I've met a few times. He has researched this really comprehensively. He's done some really interesting studies, and he's found that the answer is kind of yes and no, right? It does change the way people think about the environment and does help them see things in new and interesting ways. But then if you ask them a month later, they may not remember as much, but I think that's relatively common, right? If you ask me about a book that I just read and I just finished 2 days ago, I will have a much better understanding of it and memory of it than if you ask me a month later. But it is one of these things that scholars like Schneider Meyerson are starting to investigate by doing polls and asking people and trying to figure out, how do people actually respond to this? And I think that that's really fascinating. Okay, a couple takeaways about cli-fi. The things that I really love about it, like why I have dedicated so many hours of my life to reading these books. I've read quite a few that were not very good that I didn't share with you. And then obviously quite a few that I think are just wonderful. So one thing that I love about cli-fi is that it can help us reorient our perspectives. So I talked about, we're so used to thinking about the future of climate change through numbers, figures, data, letting scientists drive the story. We should listen to the scientists. All of that is true, right? But the thing that cli-fi does that I really like is it gets us to reorient our perspectives. Like, think about the future, not in terms of, 2.2 degrees Celsius or 3.2 meters of sea level rise or whatever, just to kind of think about what is it going to be like for people who try to live in this radically changed world. It helps us, from my experience, to move beyond awareness. All right. A lot of folks, and I'm guessing if you're one of them here, if you've signed up for such a seminar, you are aware of climate change, environmental issues, right? I don't need to tell you, hey, this is important. You should be paying attention to this. All right. But one of the things that CLI-FI does is it helps us to do things like just think through it a little bit differently, right? Instead of just reading, being fed the stories of like doom and gloom and dread and fear about the future, we can think about actual people living their lives in this future. And like, they still do things like, fall in love, and they play with their kids, and they, go out on dates, and like all of this wonderful stuff people will continue to do in this climate change future. And then finally, is I think it really helps us envision what this radically different future is going to look like, right? I'll just say it one more time. Numbers, facts, figures are all very helpful in terms of imagining from one perspective what this future is going to look like, but it's not the same as actually reading a story that is crafted with great care and thought by a masterful writer, inhabiting the perspective of a character or characters, seeing their experiences, seeing how they react, how they think about things, how these changes that have been made to the world, how this different future, what do people do that's similar? What do people do that's different? How does this change our lives? How does this not change our lives? Does it in really interesting and exciting ways. I have one sort of last slide here, which is designed in part as a reading guide, some suggestions, including a couple that I've mentioned already. But there's more movie adaptations coming as well. In fact, most of Octavia Butler's work is currently in some stage of production, either as a show or film. And a lot of these other ones are in that as well. So that's it. That's what I have for you today. I would love to take any questions or hear any comments. Please share.
Well, that was very interesting. Thank you so much, Ted. I
course.
think you gave us a lot of good perspectives and a lot of good options for some interesting reading going forward. And I do have to say, I was going to ask you why you did, you've devoted so much of your time and expertise to this topic, but I think you really summarized that for us in that final question that the final slide that you showed. So thank you so much for that. Does anybody have any other questions or comments for our presenter this evening?
So I was just going to revisit the original question. I know that you did show some examples of books that were more utopian than dystopian, but there was a second half to that question that asked,
thank you.
Is there some worry that, this could motivate
I do think there is some worry about that in terms of utopian thinking about climate change. But I personally, again, this is my favorite thing to talk about when it comes to CLI-FI, because I think that what we really do, I think, need more utopian stories of the future. And I don't mean utopian stories in the sense of this, just beautiful, perfect world where everyone is happy, right? I mean, that no actual literary utopias are like that anyway. Every single utopia that was written from the time of Thomas More in the Renaissance until now, a utopia always has a point. In fact, most of the best utopian stories are written in such a way that they show us a society that has so many, it's so successful in so many ways. And the intention of utopia in that sense is actually almost exactly the same as dystopia. Like if dystopia is trying to scare people into saying like, hey, look what the world could be like if we don't change course, right? Utopias do the exact opposite of that, which has the same purpose, which is to say, hey, look what this world could be like if we made these decisions instead, right? Which has the same goal, really, of critiquing the current direction that we're on. And I'll say one other thing, which is the reason I think that the utopian approach is, I think, actually more motivating, is that what it does for me specifically, and I think for others that I've talked to about this, is it produces in you, when you're reading, a desire for that future to happen, right? So if you read it and you're like, man, I love that. That's amazing, right? I would love to make that happen. There was a book written in 1975 called Ecotopia by a writer named Kallenbach. And it's sort of like very like hippie-ish book. It doesn't read that great right now from my perspective. But there's this one thing in this ecotopian society that he describes where the scientists in this culture have spent massive amounts of time in research and development to create a plastic that is biodegradable. So like they go to the store and they get their milk, right? And then they just throw it in when they're done, they throw it in the compost. And it biodegrades in like, 2-3 weeks, right? So this culture is spending it's paying its researchers, it's convincing its manufacturers to innovate in new and exciting ways, but it's not what we have now, where we just externalize those costs of plastic. They instead spend so much time innovating. So like every time I think and read about that, I want that plastic to exist so bad, so like it produces in me that desire, like every time I touch plastic, I'm like, man, I wish I could just throw this away in the trash and it would biodegrade in 2 weeks rather than 800 years or whatever, so.
Well, thank you for that. Does anyone have any other comments or questions that they like to, put out there?
I tried to raise, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I tried to find the raise hand icon, but I can't find it. Anyway, the whole thing about the utopian and dystopian kind of makes me wonder about what's ultimately going to motivate people to get serious about climate change. And I think, from what I see, people think a single degree change in Celsius temperature, a ½ degree change in Celsius temperature, it's a big yawner.
Yeah.
Big deal. Okay, I can take the temperature of 70.5 degrees as opposed to, but so I'm interested in what's going to get people serious about this. And I think back to when I was growing up in the 60s, and there was a couple. I remember studying this in college. This was it, Paul Ehrlich and his wife, man.
Yep.
And that was such a big deal. Not that they were writing Cli-Fi, but they were certainly espousing a notion that overpopulation of the planet was going to be dystopian. And sure, people became frightened, and I became a little uneasy about it. And then that never transpired. It just kind of faded by the wayside. So what's going to make people get serious about climate? Is it going to be the domain of Cli-Fi authors that really kind of helps people connect the dots?
I would love it. I mean, I think that, as sad as it is to say, like, I think if it was going to be a specific genre that did it, it probably would not be like literature. It would probably be like a TV series that became extremely popular. But that doesn't, I mean, I think so many works of, if you watch some of the best TV shows these days are strikingly similar to some of the best novels in the way that they develop characters over multiple streams of interactions. And anyway, it's very novelistic, a lot of the best TV. So I don't say that with any judgment at all. I think that could be possible. And I think it's like kind of go out of the realm of fiction specifically, most people will be more motivated to act when they think that it will have an impact on them, their lives, their families, the people that they love. I'm basing this is not anecdotal. This is based on very comprehensive survey data, right? So if you ask people, are you worried about climate change? About 3/4 of Americans today say, yes, I'm worried about climate change, right? But if you ask Americans, are you concerned that climate change is going to affect you personally? About 1/4 of them say yes to that. So it's really radically different. And I think that once folks start to realize that this is having an impact on, not just the life of my, we're used to talking about like, oh, my children and grandchildren or whatever, this sort of very much the children of the future sort of scenario. It doesn't have to be that. I mean, it's impacting our lives now. It's impacting it today, right? And it will continue to do so. And I think what we need to do is get better at making those connections, at putting the dots together. And just to use, your town as an example of Hopatcong, like 20 years ago, at the time of the flood, there would be no self-respecting scientist who would go on CNN or local news, whatever it is, and say, this storm was caused by climate change. They would do that because they wouldn't know, right? They would not feel confident saying that. Like even the best climate scientists in the world who had the highest level of specialization and knowledge, they would say something like, climate change is going to make the possibility of events like this more, events like this will become more frequent and the possibility will increase, right? That's what they would say. They would couch it in this language of no single storm is caused by climate change, but climate change makes storms in general worse, right? Which was scientifically accurate at the time. However, now, in part because of how powerful supercomputers are at calculating weather data, even in the past 5 years, scientists now are much more confident at saying things like, this storm was caused by a higher temperature in the ocean meeting a high, the whatever atmospheric conditions were created is definitely the result of climate change, right? Like this part of the ocean where this storm formed is 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was in 1940, right? So I feel very confident saying that this was caused by climate change. And I think that that's actually one thing that's starting to change, and like using this 20-year anniversary as a chance to say that, because scientists don't want to say things that aren't true. That's what makes them scientists, and they're really good at that, and they need to be respected for that. But really, because the science of it has changed, I think you'll start to hear more stuff like that. And I think that will actually, like, these extreme weather events are probably the other thing, that will help people realize, oh, this can affect me. This can affect my community, right? It's not just something that will affect people on low-lying islands in the South Pacific, right?
Could I ask a follow-up?
Oh, please.
Ted, go back to your youth.
Yeah.
What motivated you? What sparked your
A great question.
Mom, dad,
Yeah.
teacher, class?
I think probably a main thing for me, I mean, I did grow up, I grew up in southern New Jersey in a place that is in Gloucester County. It's actually really close to Rowan, where I live now, but it was mostly agriculture. There were farms around me. It became the fastest growing county in the country when I was a teenager. So it just like lots of development. The area around my parents' house where I grew up is now a 55 and over development. It's very nice, very charming. Everyone who lives there is wonderful, but it used to be a tomato field, so I would there were tomatoes growing right outside of my house. So I think that just kind of helped me as a kid instill it. But the thing that really changed my mind and my perspective was my junior year of college. I spent a semester in the woods in Southern Oregon, living in a cabin and reading books. And talking with other people who had come there for the same reason. And while I was there every day, I took a walk in the woods for at least an hour We went backpacking a couple different places, and just like that time of being so closely connected to the natural world really shifted my perspective.
Can you give us a link to that cabin?
Oh man, I wish. It's called the Oregon Extension. It still exists. They take, it's this group of professors. They're wonderful. They've been doing it since the 70s. They take a group of college students, and now it feels even more amazing to me because, when I was in college over 20 years ago, like we had CDs and headphones, but that we didn't have cell phones, or I had a computer that wasn't connected to the internet like that, but now these students purposefully leave their devices behind and spend this semester in the woods because they want to, right? So it's even more powerful now. It's spectacular.
Well, thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Is there any other comments or questions before we close out our program?
I have one. I promised to make it fast, Donna. I have a bunch and I want to string them together, but I'm going to hold back because I realize the time. But it's probably a theme of novels. It's definitely a theme of like climate change movies where we devolve in this dystopia. We devolve into like these tribes that fight over resources, and the resources are either water or food. It's always water or food, right? And I noticed in that one novel by the author Bacigalupi, if I'm saying that correctly,
Yeah, that's right.
the resource is calories, and there's that reference to calorie companies. Is that the most unique resource that is prized in all of the climate change themed novels? It has to be, or are there more interesting ones other than the usual?
I think that's unique to Bacigalupi. That's one of the things that's really inventive about this world that he creates, and it's really fascinating because we think about right now, we move things by using fossil fuels. If like, we move, goods, products, right? If we didn't have fossil fuels to move goods around, how would we do it? We would go back to the way that people did it for millennia before that, which was like horses and workers, So at that point, the thing that becomes this foundation of the economy is the calories that you feed the animals and the people to make the economy go. So yeah. And yeah, the dystopian fighting over resources stuff is, I find it very unhelpful. Like, I think that's not, most of this, like scientists you talk to who are really plugged into forecasting the future, like that is not the dystopian world that we are headed towards. Like we are headed perhaps towards a world where there is radically increasing inequality, right? Between the people who can afford to weather these storms and be safe from them versus the people who can't. And we have more extreme weather event. We have all of these things we're headed towards in the future, but it's not, it's not devolving into a pre-industrial civilization. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Based on everything I've read, that's not what I would worry about.
All righty. So I think if we have any other questions, we really thank you, Ted, for sharing your expertise and all that you have on this genre. We really do appreciate it. I found it to be rather fascinating, and I hope everyone else did.
Thank you.
Before we
I haven't
close,
read any of these books. I'm gonna have to order them.
I know we have some good summer reading, right? Before we close our program, I just have a couple of announcements I'd like to make. If you haven't had the opportunity to look at the Lake Hopatcong Historic Flood of 2000, we do have the virtual photo exhibit available on our website, and we encourage everyone to take a look at it. There's a lot of good photographs of the flood back then from 2000. And also our final speaker in this series. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, it is a grant that was funded through the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. So we thank them for their support. But our final speaker will be on Wednesday, June 15th. And the New Jersey State climatologist, Dr. Dave Robinson, will be presenting on New Jersey's weather and climate extremes, signs of a changing climate. I'm sure Ted will see some of those interesting graphics that you had mentioned. The registration for that program will be opening up on Friday, June 9th. And again, the program is on Wednesday, June 15th. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed the program. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.